let's talk about some players to watch here for this game on Saturday against Texas Tech. Start with the offense, Kevin. Who's a player you will be keeping an eye on offensively for Kansas in Lubbock?
Yeah, I feel like every week I say it should be Jalen Daniels, and then I go with somebody else. And so this week I'll just say it's Jalen Daniels, right? Like I think that when you look at this game, it does remind me a lot of the Missouri game in terms of potentially the way that your defense could be on the field. You're dealing with a lot of offensive weapons where it's going to be difficult to slow down the other team because you take away ABC, they have no problems getting the ball to D, E, and F. And I think that that's going to be a big part of it. And then when you look at the offensive line working against that Texas Tech defensive line, I don't know that Kansas is going to be able to run the ball consistently in this one. You would love to see it, right? Like if there were ever a time for this year's team to just bust out 250 yards at 5.5 yards a carry, this would be great. But I think the other part of that, Nick, and one of the things I've mentioned before that I think is so underrated about Jalen Daniels is he is one of the best quarterbacks that I've seen in terms of turning bad plays into good plays from a pressure standpoint. When you look at, hey, guys are getting up the field in the pass rush, he looks dead to rights. There's two guys with him in their sights, and he just kind of squeezes around and either finds a receiver or runs downfield. And when you look at last year, I think we can admit Jalen was at the best, you would say he was rusty to start the year. Still only got sacked 10 times all year. And that was with him having some games where he was running for his life pretty consistently. This year, by the way, Nick, he's on the exact same pace. He's been sacked 5 times through 6 games. And I think we've seen similar stuff, right? Where you've seen Jalen get pressured and basically bail out a missed block or a missed protection and go make a play. And so I think both his ability to avoid pressure, the fact that he's probably going to need to make the odd play with his legs, and the fact that if they're taking away the running game, Jalen Daniels is going to have a really good game for Kansas to have a shot. I'd love to say somebody like Emmanuel Henderson because of the need for explosives, but really, I think this is a Jalen game where you look at it and say, if Jalen is merely, a B game for him, I don't know that Kansas wins. If Jalen goes out and puts together an A game, you might have a chance to pull this thing out in Lubbock.
My pick or picks,
All
I'm
right.
going to tee it a little bit here, do tie in with Jalen Daniels and some of what you just talked about. In that, I am going to look at the offensive tackles for Kansas. I'm picking Enrique Cruz and Calvin Clements.
Yeah.
Those two guys are going to be in for some very, very important snaps coming up on Saturday because of the Texas Tech pass rush and kind of what we've outlined and what the Red Raiders can bring. And so I'm kind of looking at those guys. I think you and I talked, and we haven't really talked much about Calvin Clements really at all this season. And, that can be a good thing, right? When you're not talking about the offensive line, but also, for a player of his caliber, you want to see him pop and make some plays. So he's certainly one to keep an eye on. And then Enrique Cruz, who battled with Nolan Gorsica and eventually kind of locked down that tackle spot opposite Calvin Clements. Big game for those guys. Big game for those guys to ensure that Jalen Daniels has enough time to create and to make the plays that you just talked about, right? Like, I do agree with you. Like Jalen Daniels, one of his more probably underrated qualities about him is that creativity that he has, is that ability that he can escape, his elusiveness in the pocket and his ability to then go from there and make plays down the field or scramble. But you still have to give him the opportunity to even do that, right? And so I think the bookends of the offensive line will be very critical in this game for Kansas, the two tackles going up against some of that pass rush for Texas Tech, because the last thing you want to see is guys coming off the edge and immediately either, crunching Jalen Daniels in the pocket or keeping him hemmed in or not letting him scramble or worst case scenario, sacking him every time. So those are the guys that I'll be keeping an eye on this game. And again, I think it very much does directly tie into what you talked about with Jalen Daniels and what he can bring to the table. Because, yeah, I mean, Emmanuel Henderson's going to be important, obviously. Cam Pickett's going to be important, obviously. You mentioned the run game, with LeSean Williams. Hopefully, you'd love to see that get going a little bit. I'll be curious to see if Bowden Gruen re-equips the cloak of invisibility. After swapping out, recognizing he's whatever his opponent is. In an RPG, before you go into a cave, what equipment you're going to need ahead of time. So maybe he'll go back to the cloak of invisibility for this game, but yeah, I'm looking at the offensive line. I'm looking at the tackle specifically to make sure that Jalen Daniels does have the time to do what he can do best, or put him in a position to do what he can do best in this game.
David Bailey had some absolutely dirty pass rush moves in their last game. I think, not that he's been bad this season. Romello Height has been terrific, but I think David Bailey is starting to build that confidence level where he's starting to really come on. The other thing about that defensive line, Nick, that's kind of wild, I think Kansas's defensive tackles have been pretty good. Would you agree, generally speaking?
Yeah. Yeah, overall, yeah.
So Tommy Dunn on Pro Football Focus is Kansas's highest rated defensive tackle. Texas Tech has 4 defensive tackles rated higher than Tommy Dunn. So Texas Tech's defensive line, their front, and obviously you start talking about that linebacking group and Jacob Rodriguez. That's a tall task for that offensive line. And if Calvin, has the kind of game that he's capable of, and he's had some struggles this year, Nick, then that could go a long way toward, Kansas kind of mitigating that threat a little bit and maybe having a little bit better chance on offense.
On the flip side, the Kansas defense coming off that game against UCF, especially in the second half, they shut out the Knights. Maybe that helps them build a little bit of confidence heading into this game. Hopefully it's not fool's gold and that they can start to build, but obviously a tall task for them defensively as well against this Texas Tech offense. I mentioned earlier, 570 yards of offense almost. They're very balanced. And so for this Kansas defense, Kevin, who are you keeping an eye on for KU on Saturday?
Yeah, I love your point about the confidence thing. I've said on the show before, there's nothing more dangerous than, a group of 18 to 22-year-olds with confidence. And it is amazing how much better players play when they're in those situations and they've made big plays. And I actually had a chance to ask Lance Leipold about that, specifically with the young guys, right? Like, it's one thing to make a play in practice. You go out and make a play like Austin Alexander did to break up the pass late in that game against UCF. A lot of times it feels like that can be just a huge building block in a guy's development where he says, okay, I can hang at this point. I can do big things. And Austin's made big plays earlier this year, but that was a big play in a huge situation that helped win the game. And so you would like to see them play with a lot of confidence. I think the guy that I will pick on defense is a guy who wound up, maybe being the player of the game, not from, I get he made some mistakes, he was imperfect, but Bengali Kamara, right? He was a guy that, came in, and obviously Kansas's defense all of a sudden started turning out stops. He had a lot to do with that. But a big part of the reason I'm picking him here, Nick, is just the fact that he may be Kansas's best negative play merchant. And I think if Kansas is going to get stops against Texas Tech, you can't allow them to get to 4th and 2 or any 4th down situation. They're going to look at it and be like, yeah, why not? Because I think that really, we talked about confidence. Nothing is more debilitating toward a defense than to get a stop on 3rd down and the offense stays out there and picks it up on 4th down and keeps the drive going. And so in order to keep from those situations, Kansas is going to have to get Texas Tech out in some 3rd and a little bit longer situations where they won't go for it on 4th down. And I think if they're going to do that, that means making plays in the backfield. And I really do think that Bengali Kamara's athleticism, his aggressiveness, and his ability to not just make plays for himself in the backfield, but also, kind of stop things at the point of attack where other guys can get involved in the backfield. I think that's going to be such a huge aspect of this week's game.
Kevin, Baron Morton is a very experienced quarterback. He's really strong, but 2 things about him. Number 1, he is not a scrambling quarterback. He is not a rushing quarterback. He is your prototypical pocket passer. He will not.
Will Hammond, by the way, the former Hutto Hippo, if he winds up coming in, can absolutely run. So that's you talked about the quarterback thing, and so that is one of those things that, if for whatever reason, I'm sorry to cut you off there,
Oh, yeah, you're good.
if for whatever reason something happens to Baron Morton, or even if it winds up getting to Will Hammond, Kansas is going to have to adjust its defensive game plan kind of on the fly, because he is actually a legitimate risk to break long runs in addition to throwing the ball, and it can really open things up for that offense.
The second thing I would point out about Baron Morton, besides the fact that he's a pocket passer, is I get the sense that he can be prone to some mistakes if
Yeah.
you can get to him a little bit, if you can disrupt sort of his rhythm, right? If you can sort of get to him and make him think fast, make him try to make decisions. I think that's something that Kansas may be able to do, or something that I guess you would want to do if you want to try to disrupt Baron Morton. And so that is why, Kevin, I'm gonna do the same thing on the defense. I'm gonna kind of pick two guys, but I'm gonna start with Dean Miller.
Yep.
Coming off the edge, this is a game where you talk about Dean Miller, and his biggest strength is that his speed, right? The speed rush, the ability to move quickly. Okay, go get to Baron Morton, right? I feel like Dean Miller, he's had some pop moments in this season, but I think overall in the first half of the year, I don't really think he's had quite the season, on the stat sheet that you would expect him to have, considering last year he was a first team All Big 12 player, right? I think on the second team.
Yeah.
So I want to see more out of him. And then the other guy that got a ton of buzz, got a ton of talk in fall camp, and even into the first part of the season, Leroy Harris, right?
Yeah.
I feel like he's gone kind of quiet over the past couple of games as well. Get a pass rush going against Baron Morton. Disrupt him. Put him under duress. He's not a guy that's going to scramble. So, you talk about maybe at times the Achilles heel of the Kansas defense in the past was guys that can scramble. That's not Baron Morton. So you should be able to get after him and make plays against him. And to me, I look at it and say I think that's KU's probably best chance of generating some more chaotic plays, putting pressure on Baron Morton, both literally and metaphorically, to maybe, possibly mess things up. But I will say the way you do that is by making sure that Texas Tech is in third down and long situations, or third and, not third and short. So there's going to be that aspect of it as well. But I would just love to see the Kansas defense put a little bit more pressure on Baron Morton. I don't think they've been as effective lately in terms of getting to the quarterback. And I think a lot of that, you look at a guy like Dean Miller as sort of your leader in that when it comes to that conversation. And then again, Leroy Harris, a guy that burst onto the scene a little bit in fall camp and seemed like he was poised maybe to have a big season or have an impactful season, and maybe hasn't quite fully done that over the past couple games. So I'm looking at those guys to get some pressure on the Texas Tech quarterback.
Yeah, I like those picks. That was a lot of the same reasoning I had for Bengali Kamara. And I think Blake Harreld's going to be big. One of the reasons Kansas runs, I call it kind of their bear front, where they have the five guys across. It's not actually a bear front if you want to be really typical, or if you want to be really technical about where guys are lined up. But it's kind of a bear front. I've heard other coaches call what KU does a bear front. And that's a really long way to say the whole reason you do that is you've got five guys rushing against five offensive linemen, and so you're getting one-on-one matchups. And so, to your point, Dean Miller can win those matchups. If Leroy Harris can win those matchups, Blake Harreld has been winning those matchups more and more in the pass rush, then you have a chance to be pretty successful. I would also say, Nick, Texas Tech's offensive line, pretty talented. I'm not sure that they have entirely meshed just yet. When you watch them, there's still the odd plays here or there, and Kansas's offensive line's in a similar place, to be quite frank. When you watch Kansas's offensive line actually on tape and watch it play by play, they maybe aren't as far away as you think they are. It's a little bit here, a little bit of an angle here, right? A glancing block here versus full contact. I think Texas Tech has not quite put it all together on the offensive line as well. And so if Kansas's defensive line can come up, play the type of game they did against Missouri, because I think what was lost with all the rushing yards that Missouri had in that game, the defensive line actually played really well in that game and gave Kansas a chance. If the defensive line plays that kind of game, then Kansas is going to hang around in this thing.